Pues muchas gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy a esta charla que pues para mí es un momento histórico porque es la primera vez que tanto Lucia e IMSS están en Monterrey y pues es la primera revisión monográfica que se les dedica a estos, pues a esta pareja de grandes diseñadores y que ahora nosotros pues también los consideramos artistas. Y bueno, debo agradecer a nuestra directora Tayana Pimentel porque ella desde un inicio cuando vio esta posibilidad de realizar esta investigación, estuvo apoyándonos y al pie del cañón en todas las necesidades y pues reconozco su labor y la del consejo del museo que pues apoya esta nueva producción que nos llena de orgullo desde el museo decir que es una exhibición producida desde el museo y no, pues no importa de otro lugar. Y sin más preámbulo, me gustaría aprovechar mucho el tiempo que tenemos tanto a IMSS como a Lucia aquí. Después podremos, sí, yo les podré dar un tour, una charla. Y a mí solo me gustaría iniciar diciendo que esta exhibición nace y toma como punto de partida el viaje que Charles hizo en México en 1933 en el contexto de la Gran Depresión. Él viaja de San Luis en automóvil hasta Monterrey y pasa alrededor de 8 meses entre Monterrey, Saltillo y San Luis Potosí. Y de aquí él se lleva dos cosas muy importantes y trascendentales que me gustaría leer para no errar. Y lo que él dice fue, lo que importa es el motivo, cómo decides dónde poner tu energía. México, la depresión, un entorno hostil, sin dinero y sin el idioma. Me enseñaron una sola cosa, no tener miedo a estar sin nada. Y aquí él dice a no estar broke, o sea, como sin recurso económico. Y de ahí una decisión que mantendría toda mi vida, no aceptar ningún trabajo cuyo objetivo no fuera uno que realmente quiera o me interese. Ningún trabajo como un trampolín, ningún trabajo cuya meta no comparta de verdad. La ventaja es que así llevaré mi experiencia completa, todo lo que soy y todo mi ser a cada cosa que hago. Y bueno, creo que es una cita muy linda de lo que él aprendió en México y, y bueno, eso es lo que van a ver cuando visiten la exhibición. Espero que puedan encontrar, como ellos decían, esa inusual belleza en las cosas que nos rodean y a vivir como un poquito más pausado y con más presencia y más conscientes. Y ahora doy la palabra a Ims, que nos va a contar unas 4 lecciones o cuatro cosas muy interesantes y luego tendremos a Lucia, que también nos va a contar mucho de su trabajo en la IMSS House y un poquito de más cosas. Pues bienvenido, IMSS y Lucia.
So, thank you all for being here. It's it's a real culmination of a dream to tell Charles Ray's story in Mexico, acknowledging its importance to his life journey, and we are very grateful that uh, Brenda and the whole team at Marco embraced this idea, and Diana, and it's been a great experience. And the reason think this exhibit is important beyond what happens during the run of the shows, I think it's going to inspire um, further exploration of this idea of the time that Charles spent in Mexico in the 30s, and I bet in a couple years you'll have unearthed more things when we can do another exhibit because I think that it's just talking to people here and having them see that this really deep connection happened here is one of the most amazing is one of the things that makes exhibition design and museum work actually very dynamic. It's not just you come and do something, it plants seeds for the future. So I wanted to start by just sharing a few specific little journeys, you might say, that might enhance your experience of the show when you go back and see it. So this is um, there's a 7 screen presentation towards the end of the exhibit, which was a film that Charles and Ray made. Each of those screens, when it was shown in the Soviet Union, was about 10 meters across. So it was quite big and quite overwhelming. And this is Charles and Ray um, at the airport having the reels for the movie in their hand, and the screening was the next day. And I always thought that was just a story, but then I found the photographer's note, and it really was the day, couple of days before the screening was intended. And part of the reason that happened is that, it was funded by the U.S. State Department, and it was part of a cultural exchange. And Charles said, sometimes if you don't let people offer their opinion to you, they don't give it to you, and that way they could do exactly how they wanted to communicate, human to human, to the Russian audience. But then there's another human to human communication that happened. Lucia and our older brother Byron and our older sister Carla got this note from Charles and Ray. And so let's see how how good your translation skills are. Um, it does have to go a little bit into English, so but I think that it'll work out. Um, so I'll give you this one. Um, that so what's happening to the laundry? What's happening? What's blowing? What it's drying, and how come? The wind. So this is Wednesday. Then this says, dear, dear loves. Okay. How much apple? How? That's a flower bin. I have been, little th. What's that? I have been thinking of, big one in China. I have been thinking of you all. T, you have towels, hers and his. This. And what's the person doing? This city is our most famous president, Lincoln. Short. Abe. You. Full. Yes, the cup is full. This city is a beautiful one. In baseball, you want the batter to get a hit. And then this is for your history classes. The Soviet news agency was called, I'd be really impressed. It was called TASS. So hit has, those aren't women, but men. And that's, it has many sculptures, the Kremlin, beautiful buildings, probably that's the battleship Potemkin, the Hermitage, and all these things, and of course, vodka. Signed, love. What's in the fire? It's a letter. What letter? What happens when you burn something? You char it. Those are charred L's or Charles. Love Charles. So you guys did pretty well. You should feel proud. So and I'm sure my siblings got it right away. I feel very cheated. I didn't have a crack at it. So another diagram or another drawing of theirs that I think is really a powerful one, and is one of the ways that one can easily conclude that design is more than sort of a technical skill or even an aesthetic skill, but it's actually a life skill, is that this is a diagram of the design process. And this one I won't make you read. It says, if this area represents the interest and concern of the design office, and then this area represents the area of genuine interest to the client. And then, this is the one that genuine interest to the client. And then this bigger one, the area of concerns of society as a whole. Then it's in the area of overlap that one can work with conviction and enthusiasm. And we've told a lot of you, you see a lot of familiar faces, which means you're incredibly kind. And so I've told this idea before, but one of the things that which Brenda read that Charles really took from his experience in Mexico when the U.S. was in deep financial trouble, as was Mexico, was this idea of never taking. He realized that you could live on very little, and therefore you had to stop using making a living as your excuse for doing things you didn't believe in. And that sounds very idealistic, but really here's the path to look to not, not charge in saying, why isn't everything going my way? But look at all these things, find the area overlap. And that means you're not compromising in that area. Everybody's firing in all cylinders in that area. So one of the things that is important to know about Charles and Ray is that they didn't they didn't believe in style for its own sake. They could admire style, and they certainly made some films that did. So, but this is an example to me of how they live that desire. This is a chair. You may have seen a picture of Ice Cube in it about 10 years ago. And you can see it has these sort of cool fenders. And this is called the DAT1. DAT1. It was one of the first task chairs for furniture enthusiasts, one of the first task chairs anywhere. And it was designed in 1953. And so it's pretty cool. It worked. It's a very simple base. It's basically angle iron that's been welded together and these kind of car fender things. And then this is another chair, the next task chair. It's 1958. And what's really great is Charles and Ray called it the DAT1. They felt that since it was solving the same problem as the first chair, it was still basically the same chair. Now, there are plenty of other manufacturers or folks would say, oh, we got the DAT 1000, we got the, but they were really about the idea that the design was identified with its purpose, not whether it had a few stylistic differences. And that was a way that they used to constantly improve their designs. And in fact, in our role at the Eames office, that's part of what we do is to as technology changes, but especially as materials and environmental issues develop, you should try to make the chairs better. And we work with partners like Miller Knoll here and then Vitra in Europe, and that idea, that attitude was there always in Charles and Ray's work, and I think it's really an important one. People say so one of the big differences between design and art is that when the artist dies, there's no more of that art, except for Salvador Dali, who signed all those extra pages. But there's no more of that artist's art. But there's no designer ever that I've heard of who said that when I die, stop making my designs. The idea of the designer is always to create something that will live on beyond them if it's of value to people. And so they have to create a system for how those decisions are made, and the family is who makes them for the Eames work. So, these we talked about how on the tour that sculpture that you see is connected to just about every one of the early Eames chairs. That this is something called the organic chair. This you saw the sculpture in there. It's a very important piece, but it's all this different exploration they did, all these experiments, all these failures you could call it. The thing they wanted to do was make a single piece wood chair, but they couldn't do it. But they harvested a design from it, and it turned into this chair. This chair is actually a metal chair covered by rubber because metal chairs were too cold if you're sitting on them, especially in a skirt. And but then it added so much cost that then they moved further, and that's the way they were the first people to make a plastic chair. So I just have to say one thing about this chair. It's one of my favorite chairs in the world. It's Charles and Ray had finally decided they would use plastic or try it out. So they went to a guy in the desert of California, where he was far enough away that they would let him play with dangerous toys. And so this guy, John Wills, said, oh yeah, I can take your paper mache model and make you a plastic chair. So Charles said, how much will it be? And the guy said, well, for 20 extra bucks, I'll make you another one. And Charles didn't really have the money, but he said, whatever. They came back a week later. They saw that the idea would work, that they could make a plastic chair. And then Charles went to reach for the second shell, and the guy said, "Where's my $20?" Well, they didn't have the money. So John Wills put this shell on a trash can, and it was his office chair for the next 30 years. And speaking of the dynamic nature of exhibitions, when we did research then, that's how we found this chair. And within 8 hours of that conversation, it was in the permanent collection of the Henry Ford Museum in Michigan. But this is to remind people that when we see all these polished things, it doesn't always happen in an elegant way. The leaps are often a little rough around the edges. So the last thing I'm going to do is show you how this process worked with in a totally different area. So this is a film called Love in the Afternoon. Billy Wilder, who was a friend of theirs, and you'll see his name in the show, he asked them to do the titles. So this is what you had to do before there were things like Adobe and Photoshop and all that. And I'm just going to go through it really fast because it's not even everything that we found in this box. So we looked at this box, Love in the Afternoon. Oh, that's cool. What happened there? And trying out all these different fonts. Making these fonts, by the way. This is by hand. Trying to figure out if there was a need to make a whole new font, especially for it. You started seeing that. And then this is all, most of these, but not all, are in Ray's hand. Trying these ideas out. Hand cutting out the letters to see how it'll work. I said to some people today that Charles and Ray had an expression, the blood will never show. You never see what happens behind the scenes, so on, so on. Then they get into how to decorate the letters. That's pretty cool. Of course, it's a black and white film. So, and then there's a list of all these things that they bought, different textures, different this. Getting closer. And there it is. So there you go. Thank you for letting me share some more of Charles and Ray's stories. And I hope you enjoy the exhibition and be super nice to my awesome sister here who took care of taking care of the house for a long time.
Wow. So thank you. Thank you so much for inviting us here to your wonderful museum, to an amazing exhibit, for honoring Charles and Ray and their work. Now, I have some slides, and I need thank you very much. So when you look at the body of work that the Eames has created, the architecture, the film, the photography, the furniture, the industrial design, the exhibitions, the toys, there's that common thread of problem solving, how to find the most appropriate solution to the need, understanding the constraints. Now, 15 minutes to talk about the Eameses is quite a challenge. So I'm going to allow the Eames house, their home, to tell the story of the couple's lives and approaches. So the Eames house is known as Case Study House number 8. Charles and Ray designed it under Arts and Architecture magazine's Case Study House program. And they lived there, they built the house in 1949, and they lived there until their deaths in 1978, Charles, and 1988, Ray. The program was a challenge to the architectural community. John and Tenza recognized that millions of soldiers were about to come home from the battlefields of World War II, and that the current housing shortage was about to become a crisis. And so they threw this challenge out to the architectural community to really discuss, oh, and by the way, those are the houses at that time. I just wanted to point that out. To use the new materials and processes that came out of the war years in order to accomplish this goal of build more rapidly, less expensively, but also still with good design and allowing and really accommodating the new ways that people were living. Now, there is a lot to say about the Case Study House program, so we're going to stop there. But I want to focus on what Charles and Ray, how they responded to the magazine's challenge. And this actually is Ray on the day that they moved into the Eames house. It's Christmas Eve, 1949. And as Ray described it, we thought it would be fine if we could do something, not just build a house, but the idea of a structure. It was a choice of structure itself. It was the idea of using materials in a different way, materials that could be bought from a catalog. So there was a continuation of the idea of mass production so that people wouldn't have to build stick by stick, but with material that comes ready-made off the shelf in that sense. Now, this idea was linked to their thinking about furniture. And what I'm hoping to do here tonight is to really establish some more of those connections that you're going to see in the exhibit. And Ray continued, "We were concerned about the use of time, people's labor for the greatest result, so that one person could spend a long time making one chair, and he would have made that nice chair. And then other people would not have that result. They would have something much less. But if that effort went into production, the idea of production, it would be at a higher level." Now, once built, the Case Study houses were required to be open to the public for a few weeks so that visitors could see these ideas in actions. And actually, many people went to multiple case study houses so that they could start picking and choosing what would work to meet their needs. And these houses were beautifully covered by Arts and Architecture magazine, but the Eameses also made a film, House After 5 Years of Living. It explores the beauty of their home, its relationship and harmony with nature, the warmth and richness of the collections through slides taken through the years. It shows the love for their home, and they put it beautifully. At all times, love and discipline have led to a beautiful environment and a good life. But what's also important is that this film was an ambassador for these new ways of thinking. Many poor people could see this film, then they could go and visit the house. And one visitor who did visit the house exclaimed, "Mr. Eames, after seeing your home, I'll never think of modernism as cold." Now, if you saw these two structures and you didn't know who designed them, you probably would have thought that there was a furniture designer and then there was an architect and that they were different people. And this touches on what Eames said. Both the Eames house and fiberglass chair were designed around the same time. But the last thing on their mind was style. So Charles said, "The extent to which you have a design style is the extent to which you have failed to solve the problems." And as you explore the films, here we see Charles and Ray working on a film in their studio. You see slideshows, you see animations, you see live action. The office even invented new ways of filming. So they created a system for doing the zoom for Powers of 10. They created a system for slowly panning over Cezanne paintings in extremely dim light. And the goal of these visuals, as Ray had once commented, they had to do it because the idea that they were exploring was so important. They had to figure out a way of making it work. But this goal of these visuals, combined with the text, combined with the music, was simply to communicate the underlying ideas in the clearest way possible. And they worked hard at communication. I was once at a lunch with Charles and Ray and another staff worker, just discussing one word that was going to be in the text of the Franklin and Jefferson exhibit. They wanted one word which, when it was translated into Spanish from English, would mean exactly the same thing and make sure that what they were saying in that exhibit was clearly understood. And as you look at the living room, you see objects from around the world. I'm glad this is large because you can actually start seeing, Kachin dolls that are from the American Southwest. You see items from India, you see items from Germany, you see items from, frankly, all over the world, including from Mexico. Different materials, different processes, different time periods, and yet they work beautifully together. They entice you to look closer. And as Charles said, in the context of a circus, but he later expanded this statement, he said that there's a quality of beauty which comes from appropriateness to a given situation. And certainly these displays were part of the guest-host relationship. That idea that we all share. You want to honor your visitor. You want to anticipate their needs. As Charles said, and this applied to their work clearly, the role of the designer is that of a good host, anticipating the needs of the guest. Charles and Ray valued the rigor underlying folk art. And again, I apologize for reading his quotes, but I want to make sure I'm using their exact words. So Charles actually said, historically, self-expression has never fared well. And they're talking now about a Hopi Kachina maker. And he said, if he were to change the prescribed costume, the color, or the attributes, or any of 1,000 more subtle things that make up Hopi Kachina tradition, he would be drummed out of the core. And in part, one, you don't want to insult the gods. But two, these beautiful creations were teaching tools to teach children about their gods and their history. In writing about the Lota, which is from continental India, they wrote, only generation after generation of maker could hone a design so perfectly to meet the need. And when Charles and Ray decided to film Day of the Dead as one of their private projects, Ray said, we were so interested in these objects and thought it would be great to make a film about them. They couldn't not make the film. And to truly understand the significances of the objects and how they were used, they needed to make it in Oaxaca. And Charles and this says it all. Charles and Ray's respect for the stories about the history, about the culture of these objects were clear. And they reveal another truth. As Charles said, well, we may think we are different from other people in some ways and at some moments. The fact of the matter is that we are a hell of a lot more like each other than we're different. And we're certainly more like each other than a tree or a stone. And during a year off from college, I was lucky enough to be hired to work at the Eames office as Ray's translator, as a gopher, doing whatever she needed to do. Please don't test me later. But I was able to go down to Mexico City with Charles and Ray, and I would go with her around the city and we'd take photos constantly. But the first task I was given was to write a history of Mexico. And it wasn't that this was going to be used by them. Everyone else in the office had the same task. It was to make sure that we understood more deeply what we were going to be experiencing and how we were going to be interrelating. And that's important. And the other aspect of it is Charles and Ray often did multiple explorations because they wanted to make sure that they didn't miss something important. But I had the chance to watch the two of them as working adults, not just as the most amazingly wonderful grandparents. And I think my biggest takeaway was how little ego each had in terms of the work. The point was to get the best result for the work. It wasn't about my idea or your idea. And so I would watch them at the office talking intently, really challenging each other's assumptions, challenging what had been done, and then both would nod And Ray, usually it was Ray, would pivot and turn her away and go back to what she had been doing. But it was that important element. It was the focus was always on the best, whether it was creating the best way of meeting our human physiology, sitting in a chair or communicating an idea. But I do this a lot. But as we went over this around Oaxaca, we were photographing the markets. We went to every market we possibly could go to and probably shot, several hundred slides. But watching Ray in particular, really looking at each loaf of bread, or being in a folk art store and looking at each pot in a whole shelving system of well over 100 pots to find the perfect one that either she would purchase or she would photograph to use in the future as examples of good design. And I want to close with a little bit of a personal note. Around the world, the Eames House is considered, one of the most important structures, modern structures in the United States and even the world. But for us, these were just the fun people. And so you see here my mom, Charles and Ray, and me and my 5 siblings. Eames is that cute little guy over there. But it was always a blast. You never knew what to expect. And here you see my older sister, Carla. We're walking outside the house on one of our trips for a summer. Go down to the ocean, explore. They said when we first came there for an extended summer stay, we walked into the studio and there was an enormous pile of boxes. And this is my older brother, Byron, who was a daredevil, going crashing into the boxes, sending them scattered. But we knew we were home and we knew we could just play and have fun in that space. And here's my younger sister, Lisa, writing a letter. I'll mention that again. My brother, Eames, looking very seriously at this boat. And here I am in Lucia Chase. And this was a film that was used as part of a series of shorts to introduce a new home movies theater system, Polavision. Lisa, my sister, was writing a letter, which was also a vignette. But it's when you start looking at the work, the people, most of the people in those films are friends, family, coworkers, people they knew who just got pulled into the project. And we often like to talk about it, about being pulled into the fun. And I hope you too are pulled into the fun here. Thank you.
Pues muchísimas gracias por habernos acompañado y muchas gracias a Lucia y a Eames por habernos compartido toda esta visión sobre sus abuelos Charles y Ray. Tenemos unos minutos para preguntas y respuestas por si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta a Eames o a Lucia.
What was interesting, many people had the same experience. When you went there, you might have a degree in photography or fine arts. You might be a craftsperson. And you would be surprised because you would be put in an area of the office that you would never, to do tasks that you had never attempted before. And Charles and Ray often would start an intern or new employee off by looking at this musical tower that they had created and creating a song. The important part of that was that it enabled Charles and Ray to see how that individual approached problems and challenges, and then they would place the person based on that. So in my case, I did a lot of different things. I was definitely in the front office helping address envelopes. I was doing mock-ups for a small jewel, a gift for a friend. I was certainly up at the house quite quite often serving strawberries covered with powdered sugar to visitors from around the world. I really was that gopher doing whatever needed. And maybe one of my favorite tasks was driving Ray's Jaguar, which frequently had problems, to the repair shop. And then I got to pick it up and drive back. But I was in college at that point in time. And like everyone else, you just pitch in. When I was working with Ray after that fact, I helped archive, I did a number of other projects, but it was one of those fun experiences where you honestly never knew what you were going to do because you would always be put to whatever that current need was. So it was fun.
I mean, there are a lot of them, I will say, in the sense that the being with them was really it as I think we've told a number of people in this audience, because it's really important. When you're a kid, you can tell when the grown-ups aren't listening to you. Like they just ask you something and then they're already, doing the bookkeeping. And but Charles and Ray were always very present for us. And not only for us as grandchildren. I think they were that there for if they were with you, they wanted to understand what you were about. And I think that is really a great quality and a quality to aspire to because it's part of what it did is that uh, it meant like if you had met them, you would probably be trying to get them to tell you stories, and by the end of it, you would realize you told them all about the cool project you were working on, and a book you just read, and a movie they had to see, and that's what they wanted. I did after after Ray died. I realized I wanted to help take care of the office and the legacy, but then I had to realize that there was a chance that they were wonderful grandparents, but maybe not such great people. So I did 200 hours of interviews with people who were friends of theirs and knew them. And the conclusion that what I learned is that they were wonderful. Nobody's perfect, but they were remarkable people. Um, but that they really that nobody in the office could tell me a single story of Charles and Ray telling a story about the good old days, about, when we did the organic chair, it was always pointed towards the future, which is pretty cool because they had some good old days. So my perfect memory, I would say, is that when I was a kid, I was very into, fish and snakes and those sorts of things. I worked at the aquarium, as a volunteer. And then by some elaborate set of circumstances, the local TV station decided to send me and another kid to the South Pacific for a week on an island where a cyclone had blown and I hope the translator is surviving this, and a cyclone had blown a 30-foot whale shark over the reef and trapped in the lagoon. And people really hadn't seen a lot of whale sharks back then. So we were flown there to swim with the shark. So for those who don't know, these sharks don't eat people. Their throat is very narrow. And but the thing is that it was as it was coming, I was actually becoming a little bit anxious because having grown up in this culture of taking pictures, did you get pictures is sort of a running humorous line in the family. I was really stressing out because our parents had said, Eames, just take our Nikon. And I was kind of freaking out about it because I thought, what if I drop it in the ocean? The night before I'm supposed to leave, Charles shows up and says, Ray and I have been thinking, and we think that you're going to be so nervous about losing your parents' Nikon in the water. We're going to give you a camera. Now, that's pretty cool. But what's even cooler is it wasn't a Nikon. It was one of the very early point and click cameras because they knew that it wasn't that it was I was going to get a bill for it that I was worried about. I was worried about the idea of dropping a precious tool into the ocean. They said, look, if you lose this, it's not a big deal. And it was really great. It lowered the pressure on me. I'm sure I would have just left the other camera in the room most of the time. And later I just thought about it. I just thought that is being present. That is really thinking, at that point they could have bought me a Hasselblad. What good would that have done? I mean, but what I needed was permission to take risks. And and give myself that permission. It's not somebody else. Somebody else can give you the permission, but if you don't give it to yourself, it doesn't matter. So that was a pretty sweet thing.
One of my favorite memories is when I had a solo trip to Los Angeles to visit with Charles and Ray, and I stayed in their home, which is an amazing experience in itself. But the memory I'm thinking of is a morning, maybe 4 hours, spent in the meadow with Charles, taking photographs. He presented me with a stack of film and this weird box, which I then had to figure out how to open. I did. And then he helped me put the film in what ended up being a camera, and we took photographs. I would take a photo and he'd look at it, oh, that's great. What if you tried it this way? And then he'd show me a photo that he had taken and said, I was trying to make it work and do this, but I'm going to try it this way. Back and forth, back and forth. And I was about 12, I think, at that time. And at the end of the day, I had the most impressive photography lesson with an expert. I had a ball, and Charles had used me as a test. How can people use this new camera that was just crazy new? He was working for Polaroid on this new SX70, that wonderful camera where the picture develops instantly. And Eames can tell this better, but I love the fact that Eames also had an experience with that camera where Eames was so delighted with this camera that he went and told all of his classmates, it developed before my eyes. And his classmates said he was lying.
These days, there being an NDA you had to sign, but Charles gave us all examples, and I showed it to them. They're like, it proved nothing. It proved nothing. It was and later, of course, they didn't give me any credit for it turning out to be true. But what are you going to do? It was good.
But when we talk about fun, I mean, we are experiencing things that nobody's seen before, where we were exposed to, new ideas, new ways of thinking. And very meaningful for me was the fact that Charles and Ray always insisted that you go out and learn as much as you can in as many different fields as you can, because that learning will enrich whatever new job you're working on. That way approach is transferable. And so Ray just gently looking at me one day and saying, so after I failed, so what did you learn?
Muchísimas gracias.
Well, I'm talking Lucia's story about that question. What did you learn? Charles and Ray went to India. You'll see that in the show. But they were asked by Nehru to help India deal with a lessening in the quality of folk art, of the goods in people's lives with modernization and colonization and all that. But how that way started is that the Museum of Modern Art did a show on textiles and ornamental arts of India, and they brought it there, and their friends the Gerards made the show. But what I really wanted to share, because I just learned this a couple of weeks ago, that what happened is that there was this beautiful folk art there at the museum, and the woman who was representing the cultural affairs of the of India was talking with Charles, and he just looked at her at a certain point after she'd explained it. She said, does this folk art, is this talking about India's past or India's present? And it blew her mind so much that when Nehru was asking, who should we get to kind of give us this survey? But it was such a provocative question, because most people go in there and say, it's all about the pride, don't worry about it. But to really say, and in the end, their India report was about the idea that it really could be about their present and their future. So they had a way of asking the right question.